Welcome back to another episode of Women's Business Voice in our special series entitled From Side Hustles to Empires, Histories of Working Women's Lives. My name is Angela De Souza and I'll be your host, along with my co-host Dr. Amy Edwards, who is chatting with a range of expert historians. The series as a whole explores the relationship between gender, work and career in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. The series takes a look at not only success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden stories of women who made a living in systems and structures not often designed with them in mind. This episode's title is Intersections: Women, Disability and Work, with our special guest, Professor Lucy Delap from the University of Cambridge. This is an absolutely fascinating episode and you're going to love it. So over to you, Amy.
Okay, perfect. So we're back and this is the podcast series that hopefully some of you have already been listening to up to this point, but From Side Hustles to Empires, Histories of Women's Working Lives. And it features a bunch of conversations between me, Dr. Amy Edwards, and a range of expert historians. And filling that latter category today for us is Professor Lucy Delap, who is a professor at Cambridge University, where she studies the history of feminisms that spans kind of Britain and the US, the British Empire, and kind of recently culminated in a fantastic book from 2020 called Feminisms: A Global History. She's done a whole bunch of cool stuff, oral history projects with the British Library, working with policymakers, has a real eye on how we can use histories to help us think constructively about what we're doing in the present, which I think is always a really valuable tool for historians to be able to kind of deploy. But perhaps most relevantly, I'm not sure if that's a word, most relevant to today, Lucy has got a current project where she looks at the history of employment and labour for people with disabilities in 20th century Britain. So that's hopefully what we're going to be talking about mostly today. But as a way of starting, I did a kind of formal biographical introduction of you, Lucy, but could you tell us from your perspective a bit more about the history you do, how you came to be interested in it, why you think those histories are important and worth telling?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast. Great to be here. I guess I got into writing about disabled people's working lives through a kind of quite circuitous route. But interestingly, it all started with a book I was writing on domestic service. And that is a very feminized sector. So really, it started with women's lives. And I had become really interested in how articulate and vocal domestic servants were in the Edwardian period, so the very early 20th century, in debates about feminism and women's suffrage, things that I had worked on from other directions. And there were all these domestic servants writing into the newspapers and magazines with their views about how their vote or their working lives might be changed or reorganized. Anyway, these domestic servants led me into labor history, and I wrote a book some years back now about their lives. And I noticed in the sources I was using that quite a lot of them had different kinds of impairment. They were living with different disabilities, which ranged from physical to intellectual impairments. And I was really fascinated with that. And I was asking myself, oh, how did they all end up in domestic service? And are other sectors just like that? Are there also lots of disabled workers? And I've been kind of sitting on that idea for well over a decade and essentially looking for sources that would help me answer that question. And I first thought, okay, we could look at the records of employers and see, what the profile was of their workforce, what the presence was or wasn't of disability. But I realized that really employers do not keep those records. They either aren't interested in the disability of their workforce, or they just weren't compelled to record it. So that was a blind alley. I then had a look at the records of the Ministry of Labour, which did have quite a lot on disability. But actually not that much on women's lives. So I sort of, the domestic servants that I'd started with were falling through the cracks a bit there. And it wasn't until I found like an alternative source base, which has actually become the basis of this book, which was autobiographies and memoirs written by disabled people. And what's so wonderful about those autobiographies and memoirs is, firstly, there's lots of them, and no historian has ever brought them all together and tried to ask, what do they tell us? And secondly, they're about half and half gender mix. So often when you look at autobiographies, it's a lot of men who are writing them, but a lot of disabled women wanted to tell their story. And they give us super rich accounts of their working lives. So these were all people who basically never stopped working. They often lived quite precariously. Whether they were male or female, they were often living without kind of secure jobs, without secure entitlement to being, having the status of a worker. Nonetheless, they were working their socks off. And that's really the basis of the book. I've got about a collection of about 200 published and unpublished memoirs. And I'm trying to trace out the 20th century, if you like, through their stories about their lives.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know you and I have spoken before a bit about, I guess, a longer standing lack of histories of exactly these kinds of topics. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about why that is. I guess we're quite used to now talking about histories of race and histories of gender, thinking about what the past looks like from different people's perspectives, looking outside of mainstream narratives or kind of high political narratives. We've done lots of work to try and be inclusive in the way that we talk about and tell histories. And I guess in the present day as well, people are, very rightly interested in, again, how society works for people who are from different backgrounds, who have different experiences of the world. But particularly in history and maybe more generally, disability just seems to be one of those kind of groups of people who continue to still sometimes not have their voice at the forefront of how we think about society, whether present or past. I don't know if you had any thoughts why that is.
That's so right. I mean, it really hits the nail on the head. Disability history it's there. It's often the experiences of disabled people are often all over our existing historical narratives, but they're not really recognized as such. And there's been very little that tries to center disabled people as if they're at the center of historical events and not just somehow sort of on the margins, hors de combat figures. In the last 10 years, there's been more, and I'm thrilled to see the work of colleagues like David Turner and many others who are, going back to historical sources and trying to draw out the experiences of disabled people. I think that it reflects the story that I'm telling actually in my forthcoming book about disabled people's working lives. The reason why they're not there in history is the same story that I'm telling, which is that they were poorly educated compared to the non-disabled population, and they didn't therefore participate in one of the biggest shifts of the 20th century, which was the rise of access to education, the democratization of education. That's a slow change across the 20th century. Disabled people were often marooned or segregated in specialist schools. And if they were in mainstream schools, they often nonetheless had very interrupted education. They were, sometimes spent a couple of years in hospital and missed out on key milestones. Sometimes schools didn't even let them take school leaving qualifications. So they are very predominantly in unskilled or semi-skilled work if they are in formal work at all. And so that exclusion has really cut them out of the academy and helps explain why they're so low profile. But also I kind of think that maybe colleagues writing history think that disability is just somehow not interesting, that, as if what it is to be disabled is just historically the same over all periods, whereas actually that's not true at all, because disability is about the interaction between bodily difference or impairment and the world and its kind of social values. That's where disability is formed. It's not kind of in the person themselves. And if we want to understand those interactions, well, they're very historically changeable. They're totally different in the 1890s when the first trade union for people living with impairment, which was a blind person's trade union, was founded, to the 1940s when the UK had an employment quota set up in 1944. And again, into the 1990s, where that quota was abolished, and we have instead the Disability Discrimination Act. So the meaning of disability changes very profoundly across all those periods, and that makes it super interesting for us as historians.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned there, which I think could be really interesting for us just to talk about in relation to the theme of this series, which is about working lives. It's about women's working lives, which we can get onto in a minute. But you spoke about how people with disabilities have often ended up or chosen to or had to work in low-skilled work, or straddling that boundary actually between like formal labor or formal employment and informal. And I suppose that's one of those things sometimes in history we talk about intersections, right? Of that there are different experiences that people have that sometimes overlap in interesting ways. And I guess a lot of the folks that we've spoken to on the podcast already have spoken about women in a similar way, that kind of women's position in society, their responsibilities as, or their assumed responsibilities for care and domestic work have meant that they have also often been in part-time informal work, moving between different kinds of jobs. So yeah, I wondered if you could say something just a bit more about that
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, I would say that disability absolutely coexists with other kinds of minoritization. So it's very interesting to think about women's lives at that intersection with disability, but also to think about how race and racialization works, how migrant status might interact there. And I've got some fantastic stories in the 200 odd autobiographies that I'm using to power up my work. Of women who are disabled and occupy that intersection, and sometimes others as well. So, for example, one of my favorite characters that I'm writing about is somebody called Pauline Wiltshire, who was a migrant from Jamaica. She came to the UK in the 1970s, and she was living with mobility and speech impairment. And her attempts to try to tell her story are fascinating, because she actually has 3 autobiographies. She's the only person in my sample who's got 3 autobiographies. And the reason why she kept trying was because constructing a voice as a disabled Black woman in the 1980s, which was when her first 2 autobiographies came out, was really tough. So she was working with an adult education project in East London, and the adult education classes were encouraging people to write about their lives. So her first one, Now I Live in England, it was called, was contrasting her life in Jamaica and her life in England. And she absolutely repudiated it in later life. And she said, it was all about a kind of ideology of England is better, Jamaica is backward. And it's true, it's an awful autobiography. It was also very cheaply produced, and it didn't reflect her. So 5 years later, she brought out another one called Living and Winning, a kind of much stronger title. And that was more her story. But she was still actually collaborating with the same project. She was working with some white women who were sensitive to the kind of dynamics of what it was to try to tell the story of a Black disabled woman's life, and how difficult that might be for them. But still, the story that came out in Living and Winning still wasn't good enough. So in the end, she brought out her own version of it in collaboration with a Black man in 2008 called Legs of Iron. And that story is much more forthcoming about her own perspective, about what it meant to her to be placed in what was then called an adult training centre, which was a sort of a state-sponsored place where people could learn to work. And she worked there making plastic bags, Pauline Wiltshire, for a couple of years. And then she had a very varied working life, where she was sometimes volunteering and working without pay. Sometimes she was doing work in the home, and she was absolutely clear that work was valuable. And sometimes she was doing paid work. And so she's exactly got that kind of rich life that you mentioned, Amy, at the beginning, that's so characteristic of women, where you're moving between different kinds of sectors, and where your concept of work might be a much larger one than just formal paid employment.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, and part of the reason why I wanted to speak to different people about this issue is that I just think that there is a really interesting opportunity to think about work in so many different ways. We often have quite a narrow understanding of what work is, that is like legally defined or about kind of certain kinds of employment relationships, and that is an important experience. But I'm sure for so many people, what work means to them and what role work plays in their lives. Um, I don't know. I think there's so much more that we can do to really think about it. It's a massive part of all of our lives, whether we have it or not. Like the not having it is also that impacts us in different ways. And I guess for the groups of people that you're interested in, or the kinds of autobiographies you've been looking at, I imagine that kind of back and forth between feeling like you have work or not having work or not being able to get work must well, rather than assume, what is that a feature of the kind of life stories that you've
It
encountered?
is. It is. These are people who can never take for granted that status of being a worker. It's always a struggle for them. And even when they're in paid work, they're aware that they could lose that paid work. And many do. And there's, huge amount of discrimination and harassment and stigma that is experienced by disabled people. So yes, they are people who are constantly crossing boundaries, and a lot of them are working part-time. A lot of them are working without pay, or sometimes they're paid in ways that don't include money. So one of the stories of the 20th century is about the huge presence of institutions that looked after, or one could say segregated and prevented disabled people from realizing their best lives. They are not the majority, and I'm always keen to remind people of that, because it can be a bit easy to assume, oh yeah, disabled people in the past, they were locked up. Some were, and it's important to tell their stories, but the majority actually were living in the community. But the people who were living in institutions, especially women, were often paid in like tokens or chocolate bars or cigarettes or privileges, right? The ability to use leisure facilities or to have a day trip out of the institution, that was sometimes linked to people's work contributions. A lot of that work was care work. It was scrubbing floors, it was feeding other patients, it was changing beds. And one of the interesting things about institutions is they want to use women for that, but they're willing to use men as well. So one of the stories that we get from disability history is that a lot of disabled men were also doing care work. And sometimes that is happening outside of institutions, within relationships where there's a marriage where one or both parties are living with impairments, and where it's sometimes the woman who goes out to take paid work, and it's the man who stays at home to raise a family or do domestic work. So you get really interesting stories there where men's care work also emerges. A lot of disabled men don't have secure access to patriarchal privileges, shall we say, the privilege of thinking that you might be a breadwinner and expecting to have a secure and a kind of decent wage. A lot of disabled men don't have that. So there's a really diverse story there about the kinds of accommodations that individuals made at that micro level that we get in their autobiographies, and you probably wouldn't get recorded anywhere else. Because if you look at state records, they're all still assuming that, disabled or not, it's men who are the breadwinner, and women are, just not really there in policy terms. They're literally an appendix. You kind of read a report from the 1930s or 1940s, or even in the 1960s. You read reports on disability, and they'll be like, oh yes, for women, turn to Appendix 2. And there's just a tiny little page that says, yes, women were not really part of our work, typically.
I always find stuff like that fascinating, and I think it's often interesting when you look at people who exist outside of the norms that society expects, or the ways of working, or how a family is organized. The moment that you're kind of excluded from that, it presents obviously huge challenges, but also, I guess, sometimes opportunities or forces people to then work in different ways or to organize their families in different ways or to do kind of gender roles in different ways. So I wondered if you could speak a bit about, I guess, the entrepreneurialism of any of the people that you've encountered, and so what work or what ways of working that women might have ended up doing that their position as women with disabilities kind of opened up, that it might not have been a life trajectory that they went on otherwise.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, because this allows us to get at the ways in which impairment is a source of strength and innovation and insight. I'm super keen for the writing that I do on disability, not to be all about kind of victimhood and the awful things that happened, even though there were some awful things, sad things. But yeah, it was a surprise to me to discover how many disabled people in general, and also women, are creating their own work. And of course, that's because, like lots of other minoritized people, especially racialized people, migrants to the UK, and the long-standing Black and Asian communities and presence in the UK, those people understand as well. If you're not going to be given labor market opportunities, you might have to make your own. So yes, there's some super interesting people who are enterprising, and I use that term in its biggest sense, right? They're not just people who've registered as a business owner. They are enterprising in every sense. And some of them are people who had a lot of privilege in some ways. Sometimes they had class privilege, but their status as disabled and as a woman, really eroded that class privilege. So one of the earliest memoirs that I've got by a woman is a autobiography by somebody called Felicity Lane Fox. She in the end was Baroness Lane Fox. I mean, she rose to the top. She was a super impressive entrepreneurial individual and a wheelchair user. And she came from a privileged background. Her family had money, but I mean, she had quite high support needs, and the money just went. She constantly found that she couldn't afford to do the things that she wanted to do, and was forced into all sorts of schemes to try to make money. She actually was a political activist, and she affiliated with the Conservative Party, and she was selected to represent a constituency. But two things happened. One was that she worked out that the salary, this is in the post-war decades, the salary for MPs, £600 a year. She said that just would not pay for the two personal assistants that she needed to make a career as an MP. And you don't get paid during the period where you're actually contesting a seat. You're kind of, nursing a seat, nursing a constituency. That was unpaid, and so she couldn't afford it. But also the constituency that she had been shortlisted for said that they didn't want her. They didn't want a wheelchair using female MP. So that was kind of closed off to her, that route. But she worked at the Conservative Party central office in the 60s, and talked about how much, again, the people in the office hated her wheelchair. They hated it. They just couldn't accept it. They're constantly going on about the space it took up, and the fact that she had to have a telephone, and she was taking resources away from other workers, and they really resented her, and she was really harassed out of that work. And after that, she put together an amazing portfolio career that included, she worked as an estate agent for a little while. She was a broadcaster. She was on LBC radio as a radio host. And she did lots and lots of voluntary work. She was a voluntary fundraiser, and was super active in a whole load of disability rights organizations, particularly ones that were trying to say disabled people can have professional lives. They don't just have to have unskilled work, which was where the majority tended to be found. So yeah, Felicity Lane Fox, what a woman. She was an absolute dynamo. I think that she would have been in the cabinet, like a shot, had she not been a wheelchair user. I think the Conservative Party recognised her political talents, but they just weren't really that committed to getting somebody like her, who was minoritised on a number of counts, over the line to get them into Parliament and to get them into high office.
That's really interesting, and I absolutely love just hearing the different stories of and such different lives. You've told us stories about two individuals, and the kind of, in some ways, some of the shared experiences that they have, but also the vast gulf between the life trajectories that they had and what life looked like for them. Um, I could actually happily talk about this all day, but in order to kind of keep us to time and think about wrapping up, the one thing I did wonder, Lucy, was whether there is anything from these histories that you think could help us think about disability, gender, work, the intersections between them, any of that stuff that, as I mentioned in my introduction, you kind of worked in the past in like policy making circles or kind of contributing to using history to do something in the present. Is there kind of
Yeah.
scope for that kind of thing with the project you're doing now?
Yeah, definitely there is. I'm really interested in how history can move us on in the present day. Although it's not always directly relevant. It's history sometimes
Yeah.
shows us how different things are in the past. But I mean, I find a lot of the debates about disability in the present to be incredibly narrowly focused on these kind of figures that policymakers are typically obsessed about. How many disabled people are working? Like I said at the beginning, every single disabled person that I'm reading about their life stories, every single one is working their socks off, but often in ways that policymakers today wouldn't recognize as work. So one of the things that we can take away from all of this is that disabled people get that, good things come from work. They're not trying to avoid work, but they also get that work can be quite damaging, that work can draw more from you than you can give. And that's sometimes literally the source of their impairment, right? That people get accidents at work and all sorts of injuries and exposures. So work itself can be disabling. But for people with pre-existing conditions, work can just be exhausting. And a lot of the stories that we're looking at are stories where people have to recognize, well, my well-being requires me to recuperate and rest and recover. And my well-being also requires me to have a community support network and to do the kind of reciprocal community work that then allows me to maybe take paid employment. If you live a very isolated life and you don't have a kind of rich social network, it's really hard for you to find work and hold down work and manage the transport, the commute, the looking after children, all those things that go into a well-rounded life. So one of the reasons why a lot of disabled people are not in work in the late 20th century is because they are socially isolated. They don't have much money. They can't afford to go out and participate in lots of activities that we might take for granted, going for a drink or joining a sports club or whatever. And in constantly pushing for this one tick box, you have to be in paid work. Ironically, the employment support system is sometimes, cutting people off with penalties and conditionality on the benefits. We're going to cut your benefits if you're not working. That doesn't help anyone. That just means that people can't afford to eat properly or wash their clothes properly. That's not going to help them find work. So understanding work in a more holistic sense is absolutely the key to allowing people to navigate this, this complex terrain of paid work, informal work, and rest and recuperation. And that kind of seems a bit obvious. We all know that in our own lives, but putting it out there in policy debates is quite an important way of resisting this repeated, from both right and left, repeated, like banging the drum of what matters is getting everyone into work. And I mean, work, the kinds of jobs that disabled people have are often not very rewarding. They don't pay very well. So we need to remember that context of how work can be unrewarding, and people need to make their own choices, if you like, about how they go around between paid and unpaid work. And if I can just say one more thing, I also think that a lot of disabled people are really traumatized by the kinds of experiences they've had. If we think about recently the debates about PIP and universal credit, these are disability related benefits that are constantly being cut, and disabled people are being told you're too expensive, you're a burden. The assessments that they have to go through are often really aggressive and depersonalizing. So they're traumatized from that. But if you look at the life histories, the memoirs, the autobiographies that I'm looking at, they're also often traumatized by things that happen to them at home, by loss of relationship with their relatives, by being rejected by parents, by being institutionalized in some cases, by repeated interactions with hospitals, by lots of operations. And all these things are a source of trauma and lack of trust. And I think that the government today and policymakers today have quite a long way to go to rebuild that trust and to make it feasible for disabled people to think that these systems are going to help them and not just penalize them. So understanding the kind of the traumatic nature of disability, both across the 20th century and today in the 21st century, helps us then understand a bit better what might be a good policy regime for disabled people.
I think that's a really wonderful place to finish, actually, and especially thinking both about the things you're talking about and things that other people have been talking about on some of the different episodes. I just think that there's something really wonderful about the rich tapestry of all the different lives, and so many different people are looking at women's working lives and having that really expansive understanding of what work is, and also the different things that affect a person's life, that kind of holistic view of your personal life, all of those things. So thank you so much, Lucy, for sharing your research with us and talking with us today. It's been a really great conversation, and I've enjoyed having it very much.
Oh, thanks, Amy and Angela. It's been great to be here and great to talk about disability history with you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.